Добрый день.
Hello. Good day, colleagues. Allowed to start our press conference of the Governor of the Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, dedicated to the follow-up of the Board of Directors meeting of the Bank of Russia. Good day, dear colleagues. Today, the Board of Directors of the Bank of Russia decided to keep the key rate at 10% per annum. Overall, the economic performance is in line with our expectations. Inflation is slowing down in line with our forecast. The economy is taking up a recovery path. Inflation risks related to fiscal policy have abated. Inflation expectations are easing up, though they remain above the levels that are compatible with our inflation targets. We've seen that the developments in the global economy and global policy of the recent months have had significant impact on global markets. Nevertheless, our medium-term outlook has mainly remained unchanged. The expected inflation slowdown will allow to consider reducing key rate in the first half of 2017. That said, the pace of key rate reduction will be done in such a way as to sustain moderately tight monetary conditions. This is still essential for inflation expectations to abate steadily. Let me dwell on factors we considered while making decision on key rate and its further path. First, inflation is slowing down continuously in line with our baseline scenario, driven by demand side restraint, slower cost increase, and ruble appreciation. According to our estimates, as of December 12, annualized growth of consumer prices fell to 5.6%. Accumulated year-to-date inflation by the end of November stood at 5%, which is a historic low. We expect inflation to range between 5.4 to 5.8% by the year end. Inflation is performing even better than we expected a year ago. Back then, we forecasted it to be at about 6% by the end of 2016. Prices for all key groups of goods and services have been growing slower in the recent months. Inflation deceleration has become more uniform across regions. We used to be slightly concerned about seasonally adjusted monthly price growth, but in October and November, it showed a decline too. As regards food inflation, that has slowed down considerably due to very high crop yields, growth rate of service prices contrasting in both administered tariffs and privately provided services. Non-food inflation is also in the decline, but still it is insufficient to be able to talk about sustainable disinflationary processes. Should it persist at an elevated level, that may point to weakening in demand-side restraint. Also, it may partially result from a longer response of non-food prices to external shocks and ruble depreciation as compared with food prices. We've seen that in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, and it could be the case now as well. We take into account a number of factors which slow down the inflation. Some of them are temporary, among them ruble appreciation that we've seen in recent months amid talks and oil production cuts, and the above-mentioned high crop yields. These factors will continue to influence the situation in the months to come, but will eventually abate. Let me emphasize that when we say that some factors are temporary, that does not mean that the impact will necessarily reverse. Not at all. We just mean that factors will have short-term effect, lasting for just a few months. The scale and focus of these factors will largely depend on the market situation and natural phenomena, for instance, shift in expectations and sentiments in foreign markets, and we cannot rely and we cannot count on those factors to be everlasting and to always favor inflation reduction. Therefore, we need to understand how more sustainable factors stand that are more fundamental, more persistent in nature. These factors depend on preferences and specific behaviors of economic agents, households, business community, and generally they're not subject to such rapid and abrupt changes, and it is crucial that we can influence those factors through a monetary policy. They include demand, inflation expectations, and costs. Consumer demand remains sluggish and continues to contribute to the inflation slowdown, though to a lesser degree. Real wages have been rising against past year levels. However, conditions for sustainable growth of real income in general are not yet built up. The population retain their propensity to save, which is underpinned, among other factors, by positive real deposit rates. The modest increase in sales of some durable goods are due to the fact that people were postponing major purchases for a long time and are now making them finally. Inflation expectations of households are going down. However, the pace of decline remains insignificant and well behind inflation slowdown. Nonetheless, I should note that inflation expectations of the business community have dropped considerably. Market participants and business community are more responsive to changes in central bank's policy and the ongoing contraction and the price growth. Another factor that contributes to inflation slowdown is slowdown in producer price growth, which partially resulted from moderate cost increase. Inflation and inflationary expectations reduction restrict companies' opportunity to pass through their cost to prices. The outlook for lower price growth under the pressure of monetary policy boosts further stimulus to cut costs and boost efficiency of production. Price for raw materials, which remained low for a long time, as well as low rate of tariff indexation by infrastructure companies, also contribute to producer price decrease. Second, monetary conditions remain moderately tight, which favors appeal of rubber deposits and constrained demand for loans. Nominal rates gradually easing in the economy, driven by the key rate cuts in June and September. That said, real rates remain high, which means that nominal rates are considerably higher than inflation expectations. As we sent a message that we intend to maintain the key rate unchanged through the end of 2016, market participants revisited their expectations on the key rate cuts. As a result, yield curves in the financial sector shifted upwards. This helped maintain tight monetary conditions necessary to achieve the 4% inflation target by late 2017 and further stabilize inflation at about this rate, as well as to drag down inflation expectations. Overall, lending activity remains weak, as the annual growth in lending to real sector slowed down to almost zero. Banks remain cautious when selecting borrowers and have very rigid requirements to new loans. Borrowers also remain conservative. This is related to remaining demand limitations and very high debt loans in individual sectors. Bad debt situation, in the meantime, is stabilizing gradually. As regards retail lending, it has declined considerably over the past 2 years. Now we see slow recovery in this segment, though at a more rapid pace than corporate lending. Currently, the scale of the process does not impede the decline of inflation. At the same time, should retail credit grow much faster ahead of economic recovery, that may bring risks to price stability. Should it persistently outrun the rise of household incomes, it might also bring risk to financial stability. Therefore, we'll continue closely monitoring the developments in this segment. The forthcoming transition of the banking sector to structural liquidity surplus will not make any meaningful impact on monetary conditions. In order to absorb surplus liquidity, we hold on a regular basis deposit auctions, maintaining money market rates close to the key rate. By doing so, we remain fully capable to influence interest rates in the economy through our monetary policy toolkit. Third, talking about the economy is gradually moving towards recovery, which is also in line with the baseline scenario of the Bank of Russia. However, the recovery in business activity remains slow and uneven in different sectors. In third quarter, the annualized GDP decline slowed down to 0.4%, which was very much in line with our expectations. As of year-end, annual GDP set to decline to 0.7%. In third quarter, the GDP decline stopped as industrial output posted solid growth. We can expect slight positive quarterly GDP growth rate in the current quarter. That said, the upturn in production and investment activity remains uneven. We note positive impact that input substitution and advancement in non-oil and gas exports bring, yet developments remain fragmented. That said, regards manufacturing sector, rebound is ongoing in production of individual segments, consumer products, for instance, household appliances, footwear, pharmaceuticals, furniture, office equipment, and appliances. However, the positive contribution of such products to industrial production remains very limited. Talking about labor market, the situation is unchanged. Rate of unemployment remains stably low. The fourth consideration for us was change in inflation risks. The dynamics of inflation expectations remain a source of concern to us. At the same time, uncertainty as regards budget strategy has declined. As I already noted, household inflation expectations are going down, but not quite as fast as we would like them to. Moreover, inflation risks are linked with potential decline in household propensity to save, as well as impact from ever-changing external factors that affect prices and expectations through currency exchange movement. In the meantime, we're seeing some clarity as regards specific dimensions of fiscal policy, thus reducing risks. The planned indexation of salaries in accordance with the President's May's decrees and one-off payment to pension holders will make no substantial impact on inflation. We expect that approved fiscal consolidation and moderate indexation of tariffs and payments will be implemented, which will help slow down inflation. Adherence to the formulated fiscal strategy is crucial in case of oil price increase as well. More substantial than planned government spending growth may lead to inflation risks increase. Fifth, development in external markets significantly boost odds that for the high oil price scenario, especially in the short term. But having said that, our midterm forecast remains unchanged in its key points. Two major global events influence global market situation in recent months. I'm referring to the US presidential elections and agreement of OPEC and other exporters to reduce oil production. Once the joint impact of these events is assessed, it seems more probable that higher oil price scenario might materialize, yet we remain conservative as we formulate our forecast, and we assumed that annualized price of Urals crude oil will average $40 a barrel over the entire forecast horizon. We need time to assess the impact of various factors on oil market developments. This includes the extent to which production cut deals will be observed, what will non-OPEC suppliers do and how they will behave, as well as how shale oil producers will behave will also depend on the dynamics of global demand and US Fed policy. Let us not jump into conclusions. It is possible that oil prices may climb somewhat above $40 a barrel in 2017. However, our vision of the situation and monetary policy stance will mainly remain unchanged, considering that Russian economy's reaction to external fluctuations is now weaker. This is confirmed by the results of 2016, although the external conditions were notably worse than those in the baseline scenario that we published a year ago. Both GDP and inflation came very close to our predictions in that scenario. In 2017, GDP growth rates are said to enter positive territory, provided that the baseline scenario materializes. In the next 2 years, economic growth will accelerate to 1.52%. The economy may achieve higher growth rates in the event structural reforms are implemented. Over the forecast horizon, our current account balance is set to decline gradually, although remain positive. Net private capital outflow is expected to be low in 2016, to stand at less than 20 billion, moving forward set to become small by historic standards, standing at about 25 billion at most. Economic recovery, as we believe, will not come with a rise in inflationary pressure from the demand side, even though consumer spendings as such will grow. Maintaining moderately tight monetary policy stance is to help in sustaining a saving behavior model. I will emphasize that our goal is not just to achieve the 4% inflation target in December 2017, but rather to maintain it steadily at this level. To achieve that, it is crucial to make sure that inflation expectations are on sustainable downward path. We'll take this into account in monetary policy decisions in 2017. We cannot guarantee that we avoid minor inflation fluctuations altogether, but it is crucial that the average price growth rate low never substantially deviate from the 4%. Consistently low inflation is said to be among factors enabling extended planning horizon of economic players that will help implement projects with long payoff periods and favor buildup of long-term money, which is prerequisite for economic success. Let me stop here and take your questions. Helena Fabricne, Reuters. Why have you substituted quarters with 6 months period in your report? Are there any grounds for that? And tell us about Rosneft. What is your view of the deal? Did you consult Rosneft about foreign currency? How did it happen? Dealers did register an increase in foreign currency sales yesterday. As regards changing in methodology, well, formally it is the same, but doesn't make much difference. Nonetheless, we think that it is more possible that Q rate would go down in the second quarter than in the first quarter. Talking about Rosneft warned us about our plans about placing bonds on the Russian market, and many probably recall and compare with the situation in December 2014. But I think the company drew lessons from their past experience, and we have no concerns or questions regarding the transaction. As regards conversion of currency, indeed we are consulting with Rosneft, making sure that conversion has no impact on the currency market in terms of short-term fluctuations. More questions, colleagues? Igor Zubkov, Российская newspaper. Should in 12 months inflation achieve the target, you achieve your inflation target, would be the equilibrium level of the interest rate for the economy, and when will they reach equilibrium? What rates should we expect? Should the inflation be sustainable at 4%? Well, we think that the equilibrium level of rates is at about 2.53%, should inflation and, most importantly, inflation expectations achieve the 4% level, meaning should inflation be steadily at 4% and inflation expectations would be anchored at the 4%, in that case, the equilibrium positive rate would be at about 2.53%. But until we achieve the stable trajectory of inflation expectations, those rates can be higher. We've studied the experience of other countries, those that were actively combating inflation, and we've seen that for a long time they kept real positive rates high to curb inflation expectations. So we don't know when exactly that would happen. Should in December 2017 we see that inflation expectations are firmly anchored, which is very difficult to say over a short period of time, but should that happen, that would be possible. But we think that anchoring of inflation expectations would happen a little later. Olga Tanas, Bloomberg. 2 questions. More about Rosneft. Central Bank today made an announcement that it did a 1-day and 2-day currency FX swaps, large volumes. Some analysts link that with the transaction and conversion, currency conversion for Rosneft. Could you comment on high volumes and give your overall view on the FX liquidity in the last quarter? You also considered the possibility of entering FX market in case of high oil prices. Is it possible, in light of recent developments, that the central bank would resume buying currency to replenish reserves? Indeed, yesterday there was high demand on FX swaps, exceeding limits for 1-day operations and next-day operations. We'll link this high demand with market's response to the decision of US Fed to raise rates and seasonal increase in demand on such instruments, very often the case at the end of every month. Today already we do not see any such significant demand as regards the situation with FX liquidity. Overall it remains normal, but like I said, it is normally the case that by the end of a month we see increased demand for certain tools, foreign currency swaps in the first place, and we'll take that into account as we use our toolkit. But all in all, the situation with FX liquidity is normal. As regards possibility to replenish FX reserves in 2017, indeed, and you'll see it in the report on our monetary policy that we'll be publishing a number of different scenarios. We think it is possible to buy currency to replenish gold and foreign currency reserves in an optimistic, only an optimistic scenario, should oil prices be higher. But it will take some time to see whether higher oil prices scenario could become a baseline. At the moment we use as baseline a scenario which provides for oil prices at $40 per barrel. Indeed, in 2017 oil prices could be above this level, but in order to make sure that the growth is sustainable, we need to look and see what implications, long-term implications of the recent decisions will be. You mentioned that according to your data, inflation went down to 5.6 as of December 12, but as of year-end, you think inflation would be between 5.4 to 5.8. Does that mean that you anticipate acceleration of price growth? Why and in what conditions? And my second question, if we compare December this year and December last year, inflation slowed down almost twofold, more than twofold even. How did the monetary policy contribute to the slowdown? Did it account for more than a half or less than a half of the slowdown? Thank you indeed. We've reduced our inflation forecast by the year end. It used to stand at 5.6. Now we forecast 5.4 to 5.8. Let me explain why. In recent weeks, inflation was rather volatile because people were buying Christmas presents, New Year's presents. So we saw a rise in consumer activity. Also, we cannot forecast monthly inflation judging by weekly indicators. As you know, in recent months, the monthly inflation was lower than the sum of weekly inflations because methodology looks at different types of goods, so we remain cautious and give a spread when forecasting inflation, but we think it will be somewhere in the lower threshold of the corridor that we forecast. This second question, we think the monetary policy contributed significantly to reduction of inflation. It's hard to give you the exact ratio because there were many factors that influenced the reduction in inflation, but we think that monetary policy was instrumental in reducing inflation, and we demonstrated through our analysis. We identified factors that influenced it. We tried to impact people's behavior and their preferences, and people remain prone to save, and this is one of the outcomes of monetary policy. Not just that. Alexander Savarva, C24, talking about national banks. There is talk that a special fund will be set up. 30% of the amount will be saved. Who will be part of the fund, and how will the fund be used? We came up with a new mechanism for vaccination. It was efficient for a certain period of time, but it has exhausted its potential. And we think that it is less economically feasible because right now we use lending scheme and we provide an investor, a bank that is in charge of rehabilitation with beneficial loans, and it can place this money at very good rates, and it is through the margin that recapitalization of the bank is going on. The bank could remain undercapitalized for a long time, which is bad, and in the future we will be allocating money directly to the bank's capital. As regards the head of the foundation, we do not yet know because the law has not yet been passed and it's too early to say. Interfax Agency, could you give your forecast regarding profits of the banking sector in 2017? Because in 2016, banks are showing good profitability. And how will they make money in 2017? Is it because they will be cutting their costs on provisioning? And as rates go down, margins will go down. And could you give us forecast regarding household deposits next year? And my second question is, what is the bank's strategy regarding the Lombard list of the Bank of Russia? Will you be more cautious when introducing new securities on the list? As regards expected profit of the banking sector this year, we've seen recovery of profitability. Last year, we've seen a drop in profit, which is easy to explain because banks lost net interest rates and they had to build up reserves and provisioning because many assets, because of the downturn of the economy, shifted to the category that required greater provisioning. This year, profitability grew. I think it will be at about $1 trillion, more or less, which is explained by the fact that banks did less provisioning and their profitability went up, but they did less provisioning, not because the demand went down, but rather because they did proper provisioning for all bad assets. In the previous year, and new loans that they were granting were given on tighter conditions. They were more conservative in their approach. Thus, they were able to reduce the amounts they needed for provisioning. We've seen banks being very cautious when it comes to risk management, when granting new loans, and we do not anticipate any sharp increase in reserves next year, and we think that profitability will be more or less at the same level as this year, which is good basis needed for capitalization of banks, which is a very positive factor for the development of the banking system and for its sustainability. As regards the deposit market, we anticipate the same trend to continue. Deposit rate will go up, not as rapidly as before. In 2016, the growth rate in deposits slowed down a little, but I think it will remain, the growth will remain at the same level as this year. As regards the Lombard list, indeed, in the past 2.5 years, we expanded the Lombard list proactively. We were pursuing a pro-cyclical policy in this regard to meet the demands of banks for refinancing, but right now we see that this demand for refinancing has been shrinking and is shrinking and will probably be shrinking. Therefore, we will review the set of requirements to assets to be introduced in the Lombard list. We'll do that slowly and gradually for new securities only in the first place, through raising requirements, rating requirements to those securities. We have not discussed Norm 3 or amending Norm 3. Irina Dazheva, Novosti. Are you changing your forecast for this year regarding outflow of capital against the backdrop of the large transaction of privatization of Rosneft? Well, according to our estimate, the outflow will be under 20, about $17 trillion. All things considered, inflow of assets will be registered because of the Rosneft deal. I don't know if it will be registered this year or next year. Some will be this year and the other part will be next year. But what we're trying to make sure is avoid short-term volatility on the money market. It will not all be reflected this year, let me stress. Alex Winning, Reuters. Are you still planning to diversify reserves, including through gold purchases? Yes, we remain committed to the principle of diversification of reserves. Nothing is changing. Gold is part of our gold and foreign currency reserves, and we do not disclose specific shares or specific plans. Mikhail Tegin, Izvestia. If we could go back to your comments on inflation, would it be correct to assume that this December you are expecting the year-end effect that could boost growth? And what could bring inflation to 5.4? My second question regarding gold and currency reserves. Is yuan already part of your reserves, and what is the share? As regards the year-end, not necessarily. We will not necessarily see the effect. Inflation will not necessarily be boosted at the year-end. Last year, the increase started earlier, and in the past weeks we've seen inflation at 0.1, although it's difficult to predict the behavior in the last weeks of the year. We can no longer apply monetary tools because there is a certain lag. We can only impact inflation and inflation expectations of next months, but therefore we have a corridor, but we think the lower threshold is more realistic, 5.4%. As regards and our golden currency reserve, the decision was taken to make yuan RMB part of the golden foreign currency reserves, and so did we, and we will disclose in our reports the exact share. TASS News Agency, if we look at the oil market situation, how do you think pessimistic scenario is realistic? And my second question is whether the Bank of Russia is concerned with the situation in the banks of Tatarstan. Well, as regards the pessimistic scenario, we think that the probability of it becoming reality in 2017 has gone down, but in our forecast, we still keep the risk scenario, $25 per barrel, just as we did last year. In our previous report in September, we thought that the probability was low. Now it is even lower, but we still keep it as risk scenario. As regards the situation in Tatarstan, we do not comment on the situation of specific banks as regulator, but there's temporary management in Tatfond Bank, and there's moratorium on payoffs to borrowers. That means that before the new year, the depositors will be able to get their insured amounts. I have a question about personnel of the Bank of Russia. In September, there was a change in the management of central bank, and you started to oversee the entire monetary policy. Will there be anybody else overseeing the monetary policy as your deputy? Will such person be appointed? Early December, in the State Duma, you said that the goal of the Bank of Russia was to minimize the impact, the passover of the ruble weakening on inflation, but as strengthening of ruble on inflation, but as the ruble strengthens, how do you think will that impact the inflation? As regards a deputy governor responsible for the monetary policy, we do not have any such plans to appoint anyone in this position. As regards pass-through effect, first, we're seeing from statistics, it stands at about not 15 or even lower, but this effect differs depending on whether the rate goes up or down. Nonetheless, we do take into account when making decisions on rate, we take into account various options. But as we talk about baseline scenario, let me remind you that it provides for a rather conservative oil price. You once said that the Bank of Russia will try and take important decisions on monetary policy on major board of director meetings. Will you do the same next year? We said before, and I can reaffirm that we try and make big decisions on major meetings, but that does not mean we exclude the possibility, rule out the possibility to take decisions at regular meetings. Major meetings are important because at those meetings we update our forecast, we provide our report to the market and to market analysts. We look at all and explain all factors that influence decision taking. But should we see in between those major meetings that our assessment of the economy, inflation expectations, and labor market situation, should they all allow us to take decision to change the rate, we will definitely do so. Did the Bank of Russia consider the possibility that the United States would lift sanctions after Trump's victory? Many analysts consider that, and when will the first bonds of the Bank of Russia be issued. In all of our forecasts, risk baseline and high oil prices forecasts, we did not consider lifting sanctions in neither of the three. As regards placement of the Bank of Russia's bonds, we expect sustainable surplus of liquidity to be achieved in 2017 because right now we are still experiencing structural deficit of liquidity, and deposit auctions are quite sufficient as a tool when there is temporary structural surplus of liquidity. We will consider feasible placing bonds only when we achieve sustainable structural surplus of liquidity, and to raise attractiveness of those bonds, we need certain amendments to be introduced in legislation. Those have been drafted, and I hope that will be adopted. Do you think it is efficient to support banking sector through federal bonds? When President addressed Federal Assembly, he mentioned that lending did not go up significantly, even if you take into account FX factors, and many banks, as they failed to achieve their lending obligations, it's easier for them to pay in fines. Colleagues spoke about supervision and Bank of Russia personnel. Olga Polikova became one of your deputies. What will be her scope of responsibilities? What will she be overseeing? Talking about recapitalization program and the efficiency of the program, let me remind you the decision was taken in 2014 when we were going through difficult times, and I think that the impact was positive in the psychological sense. In the first place, there was good signal for the banking sector because it could be confident that it would have sufficient capital. In September, we've seen true impact when first decisions on regularization were taken. It is a lengthy process that requires a number of corporate procedures to be observed, but banks were confident that they could use the source in case of need, and I think it had very positive impact in sustaining lending in 2015. Without the program, I think lending could drop significantly this year. Indeed, bank lending is shrinking slightly, although statistics on different months remains uneven, and there's a small reduction, but that is mostly related to the fact that banks have tighter requirements to borrowers and to managing risks. And since banks are starting to make profit and they have an opportunity to raise their capital, we believe banks will increase lending next year, but it will be healthy, which is very important. They will only be granting loans to efficient projects in the economy, and consumer lending will not result in bubbles. Financial sector and banking sector stability is our priority. Talking about efficiency of banks that did get funds for recapitalization from the state, let me remind you that their goals, and those goals were formulated by the government. Those goals were not just to increase volume of lending, but to increase lending to priority sectors that included SMEs, processing industries, mortgage loans, etc. According to the latest statistics we have, all in all, the banks that were recapitalized are generally meeting their requirements. Some banks, there are violations done by some banks, but in general, talking about priority sectors that were identified by the government, lending for them grew by 8.6%, which is 2 times higher for recapitalized banks than for banks that were not recapitalized by the state. So there definitely are positive impacts in supporting the most vulnerable sectors, lending to most vulnerable sectors such as SMEs. This project definitely needs monitoring and efficient decisions for banks that violate the established rules. But I think it was all in all a very efficient program, very needed in a difficult period to support the banks and the lending. Oh yes, I quite forgot to answer about the recent appointment. Olga Polyakova indeed was appointed new deputy governor of the Bank of Russia. And it reflects, her appointment reflects structural changes in the Bank of Russia. As you know, we're trying to improve the banking supervision system to make it more proactive, to make it more efficient in identifying at an early stages problems in banking sector. And we're undergoing serious internal changes, and the decision that was taken today in some ways finalizes our internal restructuring. That means we're centralizing supervision. Decision has been taken to establish a new department of the current ongoing banking supervision, and the function of ongoing banking supervision will be performed not in regions but in the headquarters, and Olga Vasilyevna will be overseeing this department, the Department of Systemically Important Institutions, lending institutions. For those, supervision is done at the level of the head office of the Bank of Russia, and we think it is very efficient practice. We are expanding it throughout the supervision system. We'll definitely have representatives in regions, but they will report to the Department of Ongoing Banking Supervision. We have a Department of Organizations of Banking Supervision that already exists, that will perform similar functions and also report to Olga Polyakova. At the same time, as you know, we have a number of new initiatives also aimed at enhancing efficiency of supervision. That includes establishment of risk assessment service, new rehabilitation mechanism, and one thing we also want to improve is integration and unified supervision procedures, both on-site and off-site supervision. So the new mechanism, the banking regulation, the oversight, the rehabilitation will be done by Bodnichev, while Dmitry Tulev will be overseeing everything that's related with bank regulation and bank supervision. We're doing the changes on the basis of re-engineered business processes. We analyzed and identified bottlenecks in our internal processes, and we are approaching changes systemically, and we're hoping that that would allow to improve quality of supervision work of the Bank of Russia. So we'll have a front office that was previously by our territorial branches, and the development of in the headquarters remains. Nikita Zharkov-TASS, do you anticipate excessive strengthening of the ruble that would pose to financial stability because of the OPEC decision to cut costs? No, we do not anticipate ruble to strengthen in such a way as to pose risk to financial stability. New Year is coming. Everybody is taking stock. What advice would you give to the Russians where to keep deposits? What could I possibly advise in rubles, especially since the inflation is going down and will continue going down? Therefore, ruble deposits will not be reduced by inflation, and bank rate positive. Should Russians take the money to banks, and to which banks? I can only repeat, we do not comment on specific banks, and we never give specific advice as to where to keep money. Does the Bank of Russia have any approved or planned schedule for repayment of loans of the agency to the regulator? The volume of debt is almost billion. Well, we have certain terms of loans. I expect we'll be able to ask for new loans should they require them in line with legislation. I don't remember recent figures from the top of my head, but all in all, if we look at loans that already took, should there be no rehabilitation cases, should they be getting money from the banking sector as they do with tariffs, it will take them about 4 years to repay all loans, which is not that long. 2 questions again. Is the Bank of Russia still asked to influence ruble exchange rate? And is the internal investigation over, and who's to blame? As regards the floating rate, indeed, some experts do believe that the Bank of Russia should manage ruble rate, but that should be done specific steps, which are not always mentioned, either using gold and foreign currency reserves or introducing restrictions on capital controls. We think that the free floating rate is very positive for our economy, especially because we're dependent on export of limited types of goods, which is subject to external shocks. It is easier to adapt because of the floating rate, and it is adapting. We've seen this year that GDP dropped slightly lower than we forecasted for such oil prices, so it dropped lower than we anticipated. It means that the economy is adapting better than we expected. Everybody's concerned with volatility of the exchange rate. We understand that both the business community and the households are concerned with high fluctuations of the rate, but we see that the ruble rate is less volatile than oil, and it used to be very closely linked to oil fluctuations. We're going up and down together with the oil rate, and I think volatility will be going down as our economy becomes more and more diversified, and diversification is what our economy needs badly. And should diversification be greater, fluctuations of the floating rate will be lower. And now we're seeing greater demand on hedging instruments, and those were underdeveloped because the rate was managed. And there are very good market instruments that allow market participants to hedge the risk related to rate fluctuations. As regards investigation, we really are investigating a number of such cases. For us, all instances, be that rehabilitation of a bank or revoking of a license, represent grounds for internal investigations. So we're looking at what went wrong, and we think that the conclusion we should draw is that we need to change the structure of supervision, because in the structure that existed for many years, many problems could not be timely identified and resolved. But in that particular case you mentioned, problems were too difficult and they could not be dealt with through our internal work as supervision. What we saw was a very simple case of fraud and falsification of accounting, and for that, those responsible should face trial, and we are not equipped with the toolkit to identify fraud at early stages. Unfortunately, in very many cases when we have to revoke licenses, we face cases of fraud. We try to look at various indicators, including indirect indicators, but that does not always work when people do double bookkeeping. Last question, colleagues. Let me go back to the topic of the press conference. Keeping in mind inflation is going down faster than you forecasted previously, taking into account that business community and analysts' expectations are changing, and some already say that maybe central bank will achieve inflation below 4% in 2017. All in all, the situation is developing the way the central bank would like it to. Can we say that key rate could be reduced at one of the 3 upcoming meetings? And you said that the first 6 months is a formal target, and if not, if you don't think it's possible, why? Well, the way situation is unfolding, the way it does, specifically because we were very cautious to change in rate. The past 12 months, we tried to be very balanced in our monetary policy decisions and assess and try and anticipate all possible risks. And we're not giving up this approach. And we will decide depending on how the situation unfolds. Inflation expectations are indeed going down among the households as well, but like I said, they remain unfortunately higher than the level needed to achieve the 4% level. They are going down, but not sufficiently to say that expectations are now anchored and we see no possible risks. Indeed, the situation with inflation is slightly better than we forecasted for the end of this year, but we need to understand what factors influenced it. Are they permanent or temporary? There are some permanent factors, but there are also temporary factors. Therefore, we will be very cautious when deciding on the key rate. It is not impossible, in my view, that the decision could be taken at any of the board meetings, but we cannot be certain. This is why we say we'll probably do that in the first 6 months, but it will all depend on the situation. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.